The McStay family. Food was still on the kitchen counter. 2 dogs waited in the yard, unfed, and a young family of 4 had walked out of their California home and simply stopped existing. Joseph McStay owned a decorative fountain business based in San Clemente, California. His wife, Summer, was a licensed real estate agent. The couple had 2 young sons and had recently moved into a home in Fallbrook, where they kept 2 dogs in the backyard. On the surface, it was an ordinary family settling into an ordinary new life. So how did all 4 of them vanish in the space of a single evening, leaving everything behind? On the 4th of February, 2010, the family disappeared from their Avocado Vista Lane home. A neighbor's surveillance camera caught only the bottom of a vehicle outside the house at around 7:45 that night, and a call from Joseph's phone to his business associate, Charles Merritt, went to voicemail soon after. Days later, Joseph's brother Michael climbed through an open window and found food left on the counter and the dogs unfed in the backyard. The house looked like a place its family had every intention of returning to. Then came the detail that sent the case in the wrong direction for years. The family's vehicle was found abandoned in a strip mall parking lot near the San Isidro border crossing. Grainy footage of a family of 4 walking into Mexico led investigators to conclude, for a long time, that the McStays had left on their own. But if they had chosen to leave, why abandon the dogs, the food, and the life they had just begun building? For more than 3 years, the case sat unresolved, with the family officially treated as people who may have chosen to disappear. Then the desert gave up its answer. In November 2013, an off-road motorcyclist discovered 4 shallow graves in the high desert near Victorville, well to the north of the family's home. A sledgehammer was recovered nearby. The family had not crossed into Mexico at all. They had been there, in the California desert. The whole time the world believed they had simply walked away. Who would want an entire family gone? Investigators turned to the man who had been the last to receive a call from Joseph's phone. San Bernardino County investigators developed Charles Merritt, Joseph's business partner and a convicted felon, as their suspect. His DNA was found on the steering wheel and gear shift of the family's abandoned vehicle, and his phone had connected to a cell tower near the gravesite within days of the disappearance. The motive, prosecutors argued, was money. They alleged that Merritt was being cut out of the fountain business, that he owed Joseph a significant sum, and that after the family vanished, he forged checks worth more than $21,000 from Joseph's business accounts and then gambled the money away. Merritt was arrested in November 2014. What had looked for years like a family that ran away across a border had become a case built on cell towers, forged checks, and DNA. Merritt's trial began in January 2019 in San Bernardino. In June 2019, the jury convicted him of 4 counts of first-degree murder, with a special circumstance for multiple murders. In January 2020, the judge imposed a sentence that combined a death sentence with life without parole. But is the story fully closed? Not everyone is certain. Merritt is now held at the Richard J. Donovan Correctional Facility in California, where he continues to pursue post-conviction relief and has said he intends to argue he was framed. In June 2025, author Caitlin Rother published a book that questioned the strength of the cell tower evidence and the path the investigation chose not to take. As of this telling, no appellate court has overturned the conviction. A family that everyone believed had walked away had, in truth, never left at all. The next case also begins with an empty vehicle and a family that drove off and never came back, but this one ends without a name attached to the answer. The Jameson family. They drove off to look at a piece of land they hoped to live on. Their truck was found days later with the family dog inside and a large sum of cash hidden in a toolbox. The family was gone. Bobby and Sherilyn Jameson lived in Eufaula, Oklahoma, with their young daughter, Madison. Both adults were unemployed and receiving disability support. And although they owned a lakeside home and several timeshares, they were financially overextended. They were a family under real strain, but a family with a plan for a fresh start. So what happened on the day that plan led them up into the mountains? On the 8th of October, 2009, the family drove roughly 30 miles to view a 40-acre plot of land in the San Boys Mountains near Red Oak. They had pulled Madison out of kindergarten and intended to live on the land in a shipping container, which they had already begun spray painting with strange, cryptic messages. Home security footage caught Bobby and Sherilyn moving items between the house and the truck on the morning they left, in what one account described as a trance-like manner. A landowner saw them arrive at the property. They never came home. 8 days later, the case produced its first deeply unsettling clue. Hunters on dirt bikes found the family's abandoned truck on a remote forest road in Latimer County, northwest of Red Oak. What was inside made the disappearance far stranger. The truck still held the family's wallets, their identification, their cell phones, a GPS unit, maps, the family dog, which was found malnourished, and roughly $32,000 in cash hidden in a toolbox. Why would a family in financial trouble walk away from that much money and leave their dog behind? More than 300 volunteers and law enforcement personnel searched the area and found nothing. The Jamisons had vanished into the Oklahoma hills as completely as if the land had swallowed them. For 4 years, that is where the case stayed. In November 2013, deer hunters discovered skeletal remains lying roughly 3 miles from where the truck had been found. In July 2014, the Oklahoma medical examiner confirmed that the remains were the Jamison family. But identifying them did not answer the central question. Because of the condition of the remains after years of exposure, a cause of death could not be determined. The family had finally been found, and yet the mystery had only deepened. So what happened to them? Investigators and the public have circled several theories over the years, and none has held. One theory pointed to events within the family, given that a missing handgun and a long, angry letter were noted, but no weapon was ever recovered at the scene to support it. Another theory pointed to the region itself, which was known for illegal activity that Bobby had reportedly reported to authorities shortly before, though nothing of that nature was found at the family home. There was even a stranger thread. The family's pastor reported that Bobby had spoken of unusual beliefs in the period before the disappearance, and Sherilyn's mother claimed the family believed they were in danger. Each theory explains a piece of the puzzle. None explains all of it. How does a family die 3 miles from their own truck, with the answer never recoverable? Bobby had filed a protective order petition against a relative 6 months before the disappearance. But that relative was hospitalized and later died, and was ruled out. One by one, the leads narrowed and then ended. Today, the Jamison case remains officially open and unsolved, with the cause and manner of death undetermined. The remains came back. The truck, the cash, the dog, the letter, all of it was recovered. The one thing never found was the answer. The next case carries the same silence, but it reaches back much further, to a house fire on Christmas Eve and a question that an entire family spent the rest of their lives trying to answer. The Sodder children. On Christmas Eve, a house fire took a family home in West Virginia. The parents and several children escaped. 5 children were never seen again, and their family never accepted that they died in the flames. George Sodder was an Italian immigrant who ran a trucking and coal hauling company in Fayetteville, West Virginia. He and his wife, Jenny, had 10 children, and on the night of the fire, 9 of them were home. It was the end of 1945, a holiday night like any other. So why does this fire still trouble people 80 years later? Around 1 in the morning on the 25th of December 1945, fire engulfed the 2-story wood frame house. George, Jenny, and 4 of the children escaped. 5 of the Sodder children, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, were never seen again. The fire would normally be presumed to have claimed them, but almost nothing about that night behaved normally. consider the strange details that piled up. The fire department, located only a short distance away, did not arrive until well into the morning, partly because the only fire chief could not drive the truck. George's ladder, normally kept against the house, was found some distance away in an embankment the next day. Neither of his two coal trucks would start that morning, although both had worked normally the day before. The home's telephone line was found to have been cut rather than burned. There had also been a strange phone call to the house in the early hours from an unknown woman asking for someone who did not live there. Why would a simple accidental fire leave behind so many things that looked deliberate? The warnings made it stranger still. Months earlier, a life insurance salesman whom George had turned away had reportedly warned that his house would go up in smoke and that his children would be destroyed. Another visitor had pointed at the home's fuse boxes and predicted they would cause a fire someday, despite the fact that the wiring had recently been inspected. For a fire later ruled a simple accident. An unsettling number of people had seemed to see it coming. Then there was the evidence that should have been there and was not. The fire chief initially claimed to have found a human organ in the ashes, but it was later identified as a beef liver that showed no burn damage, suggesting it had been placed there. A later excavation recovered some damaged coins and a few bones, and the Smithsonian Institution concluded those bones likely came from dirt George had used to fill the basement and were unburned. If 5 children had died in that house, where was the evidence of it? State police ruled the fire accidental, the result of faulty wiring. The Sodders refused to accept it. They hired a private investigator, who found that the insurance salesman who had made the warning later served on the coroner's jury. In 1952, the family erected a billboard along a state route with photographs of the 5 children and a reward. For decades, that billboard asked drivers a question the family could never stop asking themselves. Then came the most haunting development of all. 23 years after the fire, Jenny Sodder received an envelope with no return address, postmarked Kentucky, containing a photograph of a young man in his mid-20s. On the back was a handwritten note bearing the name Louis Sodder, along with several puzzling phrases. The family hired another investigator who traveled to Kentucky, and that investigator then vanished. Was the young man in the photograph really one of their missing sons? No one ever proved it either way. The Sodder case remains permanently unsolved. George Sodder died in 1969, and Jenny reportedly wore black until her own death in 1989, after which the billboard finally came down. The youngest surviving child, who had been very small on the night of the fire, continued to believe her siblings had been taken and stayed involved with online sleuthing communities until her death in 2021. A fire, a cut phone line, a planted clue, and a photograph that arrived in the mail decades later. The answer never came. The next case is another that has gripped a nation for decades, a bright morning at the beach that ended with 3 children who never came home. The Beaumont children. 3 children took a short bus ride to the beach on a summer holiday. They were meant to be home by noon. They were never seen again, and the case became one of the most haunting in their country's history. Jane, Arna, and Grant Beaumont lived in Somerton Park, a suburb of Adelaide in South Australia, with their parents, Jim and Nancy. Jim worked as a traveling linen salesman, and Nancy kept the home. It was a settled, ordinary family in a quiet seaside suburb. So how did a routine trip to the beach turn into a mystery that has lasted 60 years? On the morning of the 26th of January, 1966, the 3 children boarded a public bus on their own for the short 5-minute ride to Glenelg Beach, planning to return on the noon bus. It was Australia Day, a public holiday, and letting the children travel together for a short trip was not unusual for the time and place. They simply did not come back, and the noon bus arrived at the stop without them. The witness accounts that followed only deepened the worry. The children were seen at a reserve near the beach and at a local cake shop where the Jane bought pasties and a meat pie using a £1 note. That detail mattered because Nancy had given the children only a small amount of change. Nowhere near a £1 note. Where had the extra money come from? And who had given it to them? Multiple witnesses described the children in the company of a tall, thin-faced, tanned man with fair to light brown hair in his mid-30s, who appeared to be playing with them on the beach. When the children did not return on the noon bus, the response was enormous. The case grew into one of the largest police investigations in Australian history, and a nearby boat haven, the Patawalonga, was even drained as part of the search just days later. And yet, with all of that effort, not one of the 3 children was ever found. How does a search on that scale, in a city that wanted nothing more than to bring 3 children home, come up with nothing at all? Over the decades, attention has settled on a few names. One leading suspect was Harry Phipps, a wealthy local businessman who owned a foundry near the beach, lived only a short distance away, and was known to hand out £1 notes. Years later, 2 brothers said that Phipps had paid them, when they were boys, to dig a large, grave-sized hole at his foundry site shortly after the disappearance. Phipps's own son also told researchers that he had seen 3 children at the family home around that time. That account would shape the investigation for years to come. Another name raised was Bevan Spencer von Einem, a convicted offender, though police noted that he would have been considerably younger in 1966 than the man witnesses had described. Each suspect drew intense interest. None produced proof. The claim about the dug hole led investigators back to the foundry site again and again. The site was excavated in 2013 and again in 2018, with the later dig recovering only animal bones. Still, the question would not rest. In late February and early March 2025, an independent member of parliament organized a privately funded 3rd excavation of the site, carried out by a forensic archaeologist with university students. That dig, too, ended with no remains found. So, where does the case stand now? The Beaumont disappearance remains unsolved, with a reward of $1 million Australian dollars still on offer. The people closest to it are gone. Both parents died without ever learning what had happened to their children. Nancy in 2019 and Jim in 2023. Harry Phipps died in 2004, and Bevan Spencer von Einem died in prison in December 2025, which means the 2 most discussed suspects are now both beyond the reach of any confession. A short bus ride, a noon bus that arrived back empty, and a country that has never stopped asking what happened that summer morning. The next case carries the same vanishing act, but where the others ended in open questions, this one ended in a courtroom and a verdict. The Chauhan family. A self-made millionaire, his young wife, their 2 small children, and the children's grandmother all vanished from a home in West London. The motive behind it was a business that one man wanted badly enough to take everything. Amarjit Chauhan, known as Anil, was an Indian-born self-made millionaire who owned a fruit and vegetable freight forwarding company based at Heathrow Airport. His wife, Nancy, kept their home, and they had 2 young sons. Nancy's mother, Charanjit Kaur, also lived with the family at their Hounslow home in West London. It was a successful, growing household with a thriving business behind it. So who would want all 5 of them gone? And what could possibly be worth that? The answer was the freight company itself. Kenneth Regan, a convicted heroin smuggler and former police informant who had been released the previous summer, began working as a driver for the firm in 2002. His long-term aim was to seize the company and use it as a cover for drug shipments. He worked with 2 associates, William Hornsey, a former accountant, and Peter Rees. What followed was not a sudden act, but a cold, carefully staged plan that would unfold over several days. On the 13th of February, 2003, Amarjit Chauhan left his Hounslow office to meet Regan, reportedly at Stonehenge, and he was taken captive there. He was given drugs and forced to record a reassuring message for Nancy. And Reagan played that recording to her later that same evening to calm her growing concerns. For a short time, the family had no idea that anything at all was wrong. How long can a deception like that hold before it finally collapses? The following day was the last on which Nancy, the children, and Charanjit Kaur were seen alive. Amarjit was last seen alive a few days later, after being forced to sign his company over and to write a letter saying he was leaving the country for legal reasons. But before the end, Amarjit did something quiet and crucial. He hid a folded note inside his sock, identifying Kenneth Regan as the man holding him captive. All 5 members of the family were buried in a ditch at a farm in Devon, and then, weeks later, exhumed and dumped at sea off the Dorset coast. Regan and his associates had tried to make an entire family disappear without a trace, even moving the bodies a second time to be certain of it. But the sea did not cooperate with the plan. In April 2003, Amarjit's body was recovered by 2 canoeists off Bournemouth Pier, with tape wrapped around the head. Nancy's body was found in Poole Bay that July and identified by DNA, and Charanjit Kaur's body washed ashore on the Isle of Wight in November. The bodies of the 2 young Chauhan children were never recovered. The hidden note, the recovered bodies, and the paper trail of the forced company transfer began to build a case that no staged farewell letter could explain away. Regan was arrested in Belgium in August 2003, and Hornsey was later tracked down to a campsite in Belgium and extradited. The case that followed was vast in scale. The trial ran for 8 months and was the longest murder trial in the history of the Metropolitan Police. And the judge took a record 5 weeks to produce the case summary. On the 1st of July, 2005, Kenneth Regan and William Hornsey were convicted of all 5 murders, and Peter Rees was convicted of the murder of Amarjit alone, while being acquitted of the other 4. Regan and Hornsey each received whole life orders, meaning life imprisonment with no possibility of release. A senior detective on the case called it horrific, the worst he had ever dealt with, describing a whole family wiped out. Regan appealed his conviction, and the appeal was rejected by the courts. The verdict has held firmly in the years since. A family was targeted not out of anger or some long-running grievance, but out of pure greed, for the sake of a freight company sitting at an airport. The plotters controlled almost everything that night: the recordings, the forced letter, the staged story for Nancy. The one thing they could never control was a small folded note that a captive man tucked quietly into his own sock. The next case returns to open ground, a family that drove off into the night with a stranger and was never seen again. The Jack family. A man at a pub offered a struggling family 2 weeks of paid work at a remote camp. The family had no car, so he offered to drive them. They left with him after midnight and were never seen again. Ronald Jack, known as Ronnie, was an unemployed woodcutter recovering from a back injury he had sustained at a sawmill, and his wife, Doreen, was the same age as him. The couple had 2 young sons, and both adults were members of the Cheslata Carrier Nation, originally from south of Burns Lake. The family had moved to a rented house in Prince George, British Columbia in 1988 in search of work, and they were getting by on welfare. They were a family in real need of a break. So what happened when one finally seemed to arrive? On the night of the 1st of August, 1989, Ronnie went to a pub a few blocks from the family home. There, a man offered him a job lasting around 10 days to 2 weeks, cutting logs at a logging camp near Clucos Lake, about 40 kilometers west of Prince George, with work for Doreen as a cook's helper and daycare provided for the children. Because the family had no vehicle of their own, the man offered to drive them there himself. Witnesses were able to give a remarkably detailed account of that stranger. He was described as a white man in his late 30s, very tall and heavily built. With reddish-brown hair and a full beard, wearing a ball cap, a red checkered work shirt, faded blue jeans, and work boots. Ronnie was excited enough about the offer to phone his mother in Burns Lake and share the news. And two of Doreen's relatives came by the house and watched the family pack their belongings into a dark four-wheel drive pickup. In the early hours of the 2nd of August, the family left Strathcona Avenue with the man. They were never seen again. If you have made it this far, and these are the kinds of cases that stay with you long after the screen goes dark, take a moment to subscribe so the next one finds you when it goes up. There are still more families on this list, and as the stories continue, the questions only seem to grow heavier. The case did not move quickly in those first weeks, and that delay would matter. Ronnie's mother reported the family missing later that month, on the 25th of August, and at one point in September 1989, the local police detachment incorrectly reported the family found and briefly closed the file. Family members have said they received inadequate institutional support throughout, which they attribute to bias against Indigenous people. How much time and how much trail was lost before the case was finally taken seriously? Years later came the single most tantalizing lead in the entire case. In January 1996, an anonymous man telephoned police and said the family was buried at the south end of a ranch, then hung up after speaking for only about 10 seconds. The call was traced to a residence where a party had been held that night, and the partygoers were interviewed without any result. Who made that call? And what exactly did he know? And why has he never come forward again? The search has continued across the decades, never fully stopping. A property on a First Nation reserve was searched with ground-penetrating radar in 2019, and a family-led community search was held in the Willow River area in 2024, and neither effort produced any evidence. At a vigil marking 35 years since the disappearance, organized by the family and community advocates, investigators confirmed that the case is still active. The Jack family case remains unsolved to this day, with no remains recovered, no arrests made, and no named suspects. It is widely considered part of the broader pattern of crimes against Indigenous victims along the stretch of British Columbia's Highway 16 that has come to be known as the Highway of Tears, although this disappearance actually predates that term. A job offer made at a pub, a tall stranger's pickup truck idling in the dark, and a late-night drive toward a logging camp that no member of the Jack family was ever seen returning from. The next case is also one of a young mother who left home one evening, this time with her two small daughters, and never came back. Jennifer Lancaster and daughters. A young mother left her apartment one evening with her two small daughters, telling her own mother she would be back. Her car turned up abandoned with the children's seats still inside. Jennifer Lancaster grew up in the Highland Park neighborhood of Topeka, Kansas, graduated from a local high school, and worked at area jobs before and during her pregnancy with her younger daughter. At the time of her disappearance, she lived with her mother, Vicky, and her teenage sister at an apartment complex in Topeka. Her two daughters, Sydney and Monique, were both very young, with Monique only a few weeks old. It was a full, ordinary household, 3 generations under one roof. So what happened the night Jennifer walked out the door with both of her girls? At about 8 in the evening on the 12th of May 2000, Jennifer left the apartment with both of her daughters. She told Vicky that she was going to a male acquaintance's house and would use a laundromat, which was odd because the apartment already had its own washer and dryer. She took a trash bag of quilts and baby clothes with her, and she left her cell phone behind. Why mention a laundromat she did not need, and why leave the phone? These small contradictions would trouble the case for years to come. The next clue was her vehicle, and it was a deeply troubling one. Jennifer's 1994 Jeep Cherokee was found abandoned in the parking lot of a small apartment complex in Topeka, southeast of where she lived. Both infant car seats were still inside the Jeep, along with all of the family's personal belongings, and only the keys had been removed. A young mother does not leave her children's car seats behind by choice, and she does not abandon a working vehicle for no reason. So where had she and the two girls gone that night? And how had they gotten there? There was one more strange thread that the family has never been able to explain. Weeks after the disappearance, Vicky received an unsolicited guest comment thank you card from a Steak and Shake restaurant in St. Louis, Missouri, addressed directly to Jennifer. By the time Vicky was able to contact the restaurant about it, the original card had already been destroyed. Had Jennifer truly been in Missouri after she vanished, hundreds of miles from home? Or had someone else been moving through the world using her name? The investigation has frustrated the family for years. Police described Jennifer as a responsible mother who would not have harmed her children and said there was no hard evidence of foul play. So the case was treated for a long time as a possible voluntary disappearance. Vicky has said the original detective was diligent, but that a later detective placed a note in the file instructing investigators not to contact the family. State open records rules can keep law enforcement investigation files closed for decades, which has slowed any independent or journalistic review of the case. For a quarter of a century, that closed file has stood between the family and answers. Then, recently, the case drew sudden national attention. In June 2025, a Canadian woman in Ontario appeared on social media claiming that her family had taken and exploited her since childhood, and suggesting that she might be Monique, the younger of Jennifer's two daughters. Hosts of a true crime podcast arranged DNA testing to check the claim. And in July 2025, the results showed it was highly probable that the woman was not related to Vicky Lancaster at all. A hopeful new lead had closed almost as quickly as it had opened, and the family was left right where it had been for years. The Lancaster case remains unsolved to this day, with no remains ever found and no arrests. And it is still officially classified as a missing persons case with no presumed foul play, despite the abandoned Jeep and the two infant car seats left behind inside it. A young mother, two little girls, a trash bag of laundry, and a Jeep left sitting in a parking lot with everything still inside it. After 25 long years, the door that Jennifer walked out of has never once reopened. The final case is the oldest of these last four, and in many ways, the quietest of them all. A pot still sitting on the stove, and two children gone from a cabin deep in the Alaskan woods. The Fandel children. Two children were left at home in a small cabin in the Alaskan woods while their mother went out for the evening. When she returned hours later, the lights were off. A meal sat half-made on the stove, and the children were gone. Scott and Amy Fandel lived in a small cabin in the woods near Sterling, on Alaska's Kenai Peninsula, well south of Anchorage. Their mother, Margaret, worked as a waitress, and their father had left the family earlier that year and moved to Arizona. Scott had a different biological father who lived in another state, and the cabin's front door lock was broken. It was a modest, isolated home in a quiet stretch of woods. So what happened there on a September night in 1978? On the evening of the 5th of September, 1978, the two children were out with their mother and her visiting sister at a local bar and restaurant in Sterling until about 10 o'clock. Margaret and her sister dropped the children at the cabin and then returned to the restaurant. The children went next door to play with a neighbor's family, then came back home to the cabin. The detail that has haunted this case ever since came shortly afterward. Around 1:45 that night, a neighbor driving past saw that the lights were on at the Fandel cabin. But when Margaret and her sister returned in the early hours of the morning, the lights were off, which was unusual because the children disliked the dark and always kept lights on. A pot of boiling water and an opened package of macaroni and cheese sat on the stove. The children were gone, and a meal had been left unfinished. What does an investigation do with a scene like that? Frozen mid-task in the middle of an ordinary night? Troopers chased every lead they could find. A witness reported a black sedan speeding near the cabin that night, and Alaska State Troopers traced the car to 2 carnival workers whom Margaret had previously let stay at the cabin. But the workers said they had decided not to stop there. The children's father was investigated for years and even flew up to Alaska to help with the search. But he was never charged and is no longer considered a suspect. Margaret herself was also looked at closely, with her phone tapped. But she made no incriminating statements and is not considered a suspect either. There was even a stranger thread. At one point in the mid-1980s, a former girlfriend of the children's father allegedly offered to reveal what had happened to the children in exchange for a sum of money. But the demand was never paid, and the lead went nowhere. The leads kept arriving and kept ending. A tip in 1984 sent a retired Alaska State Trooper to Page, Arizona, after a report of a man living there with 2 children who resembled Scott and Amy. But the trooper determined the children were not the Fandels. The remains of 2 children found near Mendocino, California, were once considered a possible match, but were later identified as 2 other girls who had gone missing from a different town in that state. Every promising thread led somewhere else, and then nowhere at all. How does a case stay this cold for this long, with a scene that seemed to hold so many clues? The case has never been forgotten in Alaska, even decades on. In October 2025, the Alaska Department of Public Safety publicly released a list of 116 unresolved homicides, and the Fandel siblings were among the names on it. It was the first comprehensive public list of its kind ever released in the state, and the accompanying report described the very scene the 2 children had left behind: a pot of boiling water and an open box of macaroni and cheese still sitting on the stove. After more than 40 years, the case had a renewed place in the public record. The Fandel case remains unsolved to this day, with no remains, no arrests, and no charged suspects. And it is formally classified as a non-family abduction. Lights switched off in a cabin where they were never once switched off. And 2 children who walked back through their own front door one ordinary September night and were simply never seen again. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.